In today's show, I've got a special interview that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. But more importantly, one where I know you're going to learn something that's going to help you as an investor, as a business person, or as an entrepreneur. Now, if you're a regular listener to my podcast, you know that Pam and I enjoyed a 6-week cruise at the beginning of this year. And on that cruise, I befriended Lord Digby Jones, who's currently a politician who sits in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. But he's a world-renowned social commentator, and I learned so much from him that on that cruise I asked him, could I just turn on the microphone in our cabin and let's record a chat that we had together. So the quality is pretty good, but maybe not as good as you're normally used to. Excuse that because you're going to be impressed with what Lord Digby Jones has to say. Now, his bio is too impressive for me to read out. It's too long, but I'll include a link in the show notes. But more than being a politician, he's an advisor to many large corporations, and he sits on the board of a number of companies, including being the non-executive chairman of the Triumph Motorcycle Company. We're not going to talk about motorcycles today. In fact, you're going to probably be thinking, what's all this got to do with property in Australia anyway? Well, the property market is a critical part of the Australian economy, which is significantly affected by the world economy. This fact's been brought home only too clearly in the last couple of months, hasn't it, with a whole lot of issues that have happened overseas. So we're going to be talking about some fundamental changes that Lord Digby Jones believes is going to happen over the next decade that you're going to need to understand to be successful during that time. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy your chat as we talk about Brexit. Okay, maybe you're not going to be that interested in Brexit, but it's going to be positive for our economy, so it's important to understand its implications. We're going to talk a bit about the Asian century and what this means for Australia, and Lord Jones has got some interesting thoughts on that. We're going to talk about the pervasion of social media, which will bring benefits but some risks over the next decade. We're going to have a chat about the concept that there could well be a period of social upheaval in the years ahead, plus lots more. But stick with us till the end when I ask Lord Digby Jones to give some business advice to a young couple breaking away from the family business and starting off on their own. Harry and Meghan. Now, that was all very relevant. It was all in the news when we were on this cruise in January. I know you're listening to this in March, but I'm sure you're going to enjoy his advice. So welcome to today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's most trusted property commentator who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the 5th time he's won a similar award in the last 7 years.
We're at the start of a new decade, and that brings out predictions as to what the future might hold. Some are forecasting eco-catastrophes, and those fears have been accentuated at the beginning of this year by the tragic, terrible bushfires that happened around Australia. Others are suggesting the pervasion of social media is going to bring with it more risks than benefits. And some are foreseeing a period of social upheaval as jobs of maybe 30, maybe 40% of Australians and people around the Western countries are going to be replaced by robots and artificial intelligence over the next decade. To give us his insights into what's ahead in the coming decade, let's have a chat with Lord Digby Jones, who's a businessman, a politician who served as Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. He's also been a Minister of Trade, a Minister for State of Trade and Investment, and he now still sits in the House of Lords as a non-aligned active crossbencher. Welcome, Lord Jones.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, somehow I think we seem to be far more pessimistic going into this new decade than we've been in the past. Should we really be fearful of what's going on? Should we really be so cautious?
Actually, it's quite interesting because if you could look at the last decade, most developed countries had a fair degree of bad news on the way through. And so everybody's a bit cautious about running up the flags and the bunting and saying it's sunlit uplands from now on. Some of that bad news was real. If you remember, we the start of the decade, we were coming out of the financial crisis of 2008. '09. I know that didn't hit Australia anywhere near as badly as it hit the European, British or American economies, but Australia is not an island in anything other than geographical sense. And I mean, Australia has to trade with these countries around the world, and if they're not making the money, they're not buying the stuff. So it matters to all of us. So I think that hit confidence enormously. So in terms of the next decade from a British point of view, and I guess if you're that farmer in France or you're that manufacturer in Germany, we finally got some certainty. We've had a general election which incorporated somewhere in its democratic process a referendum for the second time. I mean, no one called it that, but there's an element of that in it. And indeed, Boris Johnson's electoral cry was "get Brexit done." So there's a degree of that. But also the country really did give Corbyn and his Marxism and anti-Semitism and unpatriotic anti-business views a real heave-ho, a real kick in the pants and out of the door. So the country feels liberated in a way. Even Remainers are going to have to say, well, the country spoke again, I better get on with this and make it happen. The people around the world who are thinking, do we invest in Britain? Were thinking, well, I don't know what I'm going to if a load of Marxists might be running the country. Well, now they know for at least 5 years and hopefully 10 they won't be. So there's a degree of optimism about investment, optimism about trading. And I guess if you're that farmer in France or that manufacturer in Germany, you're thinking, well, this is sorted. I know where I'm going to be. So there's an air of optimism in Britain, relief based as opposed to yet too early in January to say, but analysing and identifying the where the opportunities are. But where, for instance, would that leave Australia? Well, one of the great things you can look forward to is a fabulous quality trading relationship with the United Kingdom, the likes of which you have not had for 40 years. And, we've had to kowtow to Brussels and say Australia does a deal with the EU, but a deal with Britain on her own comes with quite a bit of family. I've always thought about the relationship between Aussies and Brits. It's like family, isn't it? I can be rude about my sister, but you can't. and we are mates, and we apart from when we have the Ashes, we're mates, and on that basis, there's an awful lot of good quality history. Both in wartime and peacetime, that we can draw on as we make a reality of the relationship, actually to get a trade deal done. And at the same time, you find us far less protectionist than, say, the French. Far less. Far more open markets. We're a very service-based economy. It's about 75-80% of GDP. So at the end of the day, you're going to find us far more open to things like agriculture than you would have found the French or the Spanish or the Greeks or the Italians.
Well, Australia's become very service-based as well. We're based in Southeast Asia, and this seems to be the century of Southeast Asia, India, China, and behind it, Vietnam and Indonesia. That brings some great opportunities, but Jones, in my mind, it also has some potential challenges.
Yeah, I often say, the Brits bossed the 19th century and the Americans bossed the 20th century. And this is Asia's time. And Asia's time has come. And notice, I don't say China particularly. It's Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Taiwan, Japan, of course. And if you go into South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and of course, there you are. You're in a perfect place, actually, in terms of being this Anglo-Saxon based. I don't necessarily say completely Anglo-Saxon. That's not what I'm saying. But it's based on the rule of law. It's based on a system of both government and economy that had its origins in the Northern Hemisphere. So you're geographically in a good place to look north and really make the most of Asia's century. You're in a fabulous place structurally and governmentally because of your heritage and where it all came from. And with Britain coming out of the European Union and being able to trade independent of the unelected unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels. There's no guessing to anybody listening to this where I came from in the Brexit debate. But you have a great opportunity. And by the way, that doesn't mean if you're going to do a trade deal with Britain, doesn't mean you haven't got to do a trade deal with Europe. I mean, I really do get fed up with these people who say, oh, if you Brexit, you hate Europe. I don't. I love them. And I want to make a lot of money out of Europe.
It's not neither or, is it?
It is not either or. And I want to make a lot of money out of Europe. I want Europe to make a lot of money out of me. But I just don't want to be told what to do by Berlin and Brussels. Now, you are the same. You've got a huge opportunity in Australia to make the most of the best of both worlds, actually. So do I think there's an air, your initial question was, is there this air of my word, not yours, despondency about coming into the new decade, a bit more pessimism? I think you're probably right, mainly because you're looking at a big trade war, America-China. You've certainly got the Korean Peninsula. You never know where that's going next. You've got this whole issue of Iran. At home in Australia, very few people, especially around Melbourne and Sydney, will have not been affected personally, tragically, by the bushfires. I'm not surprised people feel pessimistic. All I'm trying to do is show that in amongst that maelstrom of bad news, there's or bad news for certain, but also worrying times, there are some real lovely little diamonds of good future if we can fashion them out and polish them up and do something with it. I mean, one point about the bushfires, I hope it's not, I know we're sitting in this lovely place, you and I, recording this in the middle of January, and anybody listening to this in March, I hope it's still the same. But, as the bushfires come to an end, you hope, there's going to be a lot of reconstruction. There's going to have to be a lot of investment in agricultural communities. There's going to have to be a lot of jobs. There's got to be a lot of money spent. You hope some of that's from insurance, and you hope some of that comes with great hope and ideas and refreshed and new ideas. And that will of its own create an economy, and that will create some growth, whether it is jobs or whether it's investments and returns. There will be new ideas, new thoughts, and growth and hope that come out of the tragedy of these fires. And so I hope by the time people listen to this, it's over. But the big rebuild will start, and you will hopefully find that 2020 has a spike in growth in GDP purely from the real need to get on and reconstruct a lot of Australia.
Sure. This is not underscoring the severe tragedy that's been affected on people, on nature, on our wildlife. In the short term, it will lower our GDP, maybe in the first quarter, but then there's all the rebuilding that's going to occur.
Yeah, exactly.
It will affect local businesses terribly, and it will affect tourism, but in the long term, the resilience of the Australians is going to come through, and it should do well. But just getting back to Southeast Asia, when we had a chat the other day, you had some concerns about China. You were explaining the history of where China was and where it's going. Maybe you could share that with us again.
Yeah. If you look at China, a lot of the development, the stuff that we see as rivals and competition, the whole essence of the growth of China, mainly since Clinton gave it favoured nations trading status and joined the WTO and everything else. It's all happened on the eastern seaboard and coming in as far as, shall we say, a line going through Beijing. So it's all happened there. But of course, west of there, you've got about another billion Chinese. And the challenge that Beijing, the Middle Kingdom, has is how do you get the wealth that's been created in the east? How do you get it moving west? How do you get the deal for a peasant farmer on $2 a day to understand it's worth taking the totalitarian attitude of government and whatever? It's worth taking it because the economic growth and development is worth it in their eyes. Now, that is a big challenge for Beijing. How do you pull that off? And at the same time, as Trump is proof in America, that there are people who feel they are ignored. If you look in America, you've got the West Coast and the East Coast, but an awful lot of flyover states where they felt no one cared for them. If you look in Boris Johnson's electoral victory, a lot of his gains were in the north of England where nobody cared for them. Well, China's going to have the same issue. As people get wealthier in the east of China, and people begin to say, just a minute, I want more money, because we're doing really well in the world, then if people don't get that wealth to move westwards, recognition, people feeling they're more important than they figure. China's challenge in the next 10, 20 years is as much domestic on that as it is on making sure that their big customer, America, does a trade deal. I can't believe that Trump won't insist that the dumping of steel around the world, making it at a price of X, then selling it at half X. So you clean up and clear out the competition, and then you can abuse the market to your heart's content because you have no rivals. Now, that's classic dumping. That's got to stop. China's done it for years. Trump's chosen to have the row. And I would cautiously suggest that it looks like he's going to win that one, mainly because the customer is always right, and America's the customer. But when two elephants fight in the jungle, a lot of the mice get crushed to death, and it won't be good for small countries in Asia. It won't be good, frankly, for Australia or Europe if we don't get a reasonable settlement to this. Where you see, it doesn't take much to get an American to take his bat and ball home. I mean, they are so big, so powerful. They can put up the borders and say America first actually means only America, and if that's the case, we all suffer. So out of this hoped for victory by Trump in China to ensure that the level playing field endures, I don't want to see a protectionist America that is bullying other countries in Europe or whatever into doing it their way. They have to understand that America first is not just an economic situation. It is about morality, thought leadership. It's about being there as a beacon of freedom. And one of the great freedoms, of course, is the freedom of trade.
Now, we're talking about what's going to happen over the next decade, and there seems to be an increasing pervasion of social media. It's one of the things you and I weren't brought up with, and now you've got an iPhone, I've got one. You asked me how people find out about this podcast. I know you're prolific on Twitter. What's your feeling about social media and the stranglehold it's got on?
Well, isn't it interesting that the very reason that you and I are sitting in this room producing this, and that hopefully squillions are listening to it in March, is through social media, isn't it? It's through the adoption by millions of people to be able to listen to ideas and thoughts in a wholly different medium. If you're a small business in Melbourne and you want to sell your gear to a small business in Mexico, you've got the internet and you can sell it. You can put up the sign here, credit card, and away you go. And I mean, that was not possible when you and I started in business. So I acknowledge all the good parts of it. There'll be a granddad in one country talking to granddaughter in another country, and they're doing it, looking at each other, waving, blowing kisses, and it's all due to this amazing thing. But when you see how you walk into a restaurant and you'll see four people around a table and they're all playing with their damn devices and not doing that old-fashioned thing. Now, what's that called? Oh, I know, conversation. And they're not indulging in good quality emotional intercourse, frankly. And social intercourse, the ability to, often subliminally, sometimes openly, look at each other's eyes and get whether this is a conversation that people like or don't like, whether they like attitudes or not, arguments, and I mean by that, I don't mean rows, I mean good quality discussion, where you can meld together views, you understand whether it's annoying somebody or not. Why? Because their body language and their emotional response will be of a certain way. Well, if that's all going to be replaced by me typing something into a little machine and then pressing send, and then someone on the other end goes, oh, I like that. And then they share it with someone else who says, I like that. And then someone else says, I don't like that. And then there's somebody else over there who's got a fear of being left out. And you suddenly develop an enormous polemicism. You develop all black and white, no grey. You develop people who hate or like. It fulfills prejudice. Then they start saying, well, I'm not going to be told something I don't like. I'm not going to have my views tested by people who might disagree with me. I'm going to no platform them. because I don't want to be offended. I have a right not to be offended. And my wonderful trusty little iPhone here, I only look at that to share prejudices with people who are similarly prejudiced. And eventually, you end up with two very nasty things. You end up with bigoted young people. Now, bigoted old people are bad enough. You and I are two of them. But bigoted young people, I really did think the nations of the world were not going to get to that. And the other thing, very sadly, of course, on this fear of missing out, the FOMOs of this world, you do get young, usually girls, teenage girls, I'm sure there are boys as well who suffer from this, but a lot of teenage girls, and they're picked on and they're bullied over their social media, not to their faces. And then, once or twice, the dark side of all of this, they can go on and be told how to kill yourself. And then one day, some mum and dad go up the stairs, and there is their pride and joy hanging. Now, if that is what Mr. Zuckerberg intended, well, I'm sure it isn't. But I want to see Facebook doing far more to sort that out. And when you think that if all this disgusting trolling and appalling, vicious reactions on all these different platforms to what people say, if that was printed in a newspaper, the editor would get put in prison. So why can't we put Mr. Zuckerberg in prison for doing it on Facebook? His defence is, oh no, we're a platform. We're not responsible for content. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, you've got all the power in the world. You're the wealthiest company in the world. You're the wealthiest man one of the wealthiest men in the world. Mr. Bezos at Amazon would tell you he is. But here you are, immensely powerful, and you're telling me you have no responsibility, are you? And that responsibility isn't following power. Well, that's a disgrace. And if editors of newspapers would be banged up for this, why shouldn't the people who are responsible for Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Google and all the rest of it? And I just think that if we're not going to have a nasty, polemic, divisive, and often damaging and sometimes fatally so, if we're not going to have the promulgation of the nasty side of life, we have got to start grounding responsibility on the platforms. And if you look at, Alphabet, who own Google, and Apple, and Amazon, and Microsoft, and Facebook, add those together for their market caps, and we're getting into not just big countries' GDPs, we're getting into top 3 in the world GDPs. Well, that gives them enormous clout over the political class. And at the same time, people with that sort of clout tend to get treated well by politicians. And then in Britain, for instance, Facebook earns squillions of sales revenue, I mean billions, and they pay tens of thousands of corporation tax. Well, that's bonkers. And by the way, I don't know the figures, but I bet you it's the same in Australia.
Yes.
In proportional terms. It'll be the same in America or France or Germany. And so these guys are, one, they're not stepping up to the plate, fiscally taking responsibility for their actions in countries. Two, they're not taking responsibility for the content of what they carry. And thirdly, they then turn around and actually enjoy the fruits of all of this and creating a divisive society as they go through. And I think one of the great challenges of the next decade, as we sit here on the, as you said at the start, the cusp of it, is one of the great challenges. How do we get the best out of social media? Because there is good stuff in that. I mean, without doubt, there's some good stuff going on in social media. But how do we get the good stuff and weed out and make sure the bad stuff can't happen? And it's no good, Facebook or any of the others, putting up all these defences. They've got to come to the party, and they've got to actually say, we are not just the problem, we are the solution. And start paying the tax in the countries where they make their money. Start making sure that 14-year-old girl can't hang herself out because of this. And at the same time, start being liked rather than endured. They are endured around the world. Well, if they want to be liked, I suggest they clean out the stable.
It's quite an interesting contrast between what you've just described and the other side of things, where there's a lot of political correctness at the moment. In other venues, you can't say the wrong thing without offending somebody.
I mean, there was 15, 20 years ago, there was a sitcom in Britain with a guy in it called Victor Meldrew. And Victor Meldrew spent most of his life going around saying, I cannot believe it. meaning basically the world's going past me so quickly and I can't stand it anymore. And I think it's a function of me now being 64, but I'm indulging in so many I cannot believe it moments. You'd be amazed. I mean, Marks and Spencer's, the retailer, they stock us to a lot of retailers a savoury condiment to roast and other food called Gentleman's Relish. And I'm sure most people listening to this have heard of Gentleman's Relish. Well, they took it off the shelves at M&S because people told them it was sexist. There's a university where there was a fancy dress party and some guys came in sombreros. They're banned on the basis that you culturally appropriated another country's... Well, actually, as I say it now, I can't believe that people are so stupid as to allow this to happen. And there's even been a case where I think she was a tax inspector. She was a proper upright member of society, and she actually says that no matter how much trans people to whom we should be sensitive and we should help and assist in our communities to make sure that they can feel safe and that they can have a proper acceptance in society. But there is no doubt that actually, this woman said, biologically, these people do not change. The XX and the XY chromosomes are not changed because you actually start behaving like either a man or a woman when you weren't born. So. Yeah. And because she says this, her employer fires her. And when she actually sues for unfair dismissal, the judge finds in favour of the employer and says that the woman is completely wrong. Well, it's madness. I mean, that's just... And you do think to yourself, at what point are the no platformers, the people are going to say, I have a right not to be offended. You can't come here and offend me. I've got all the rights in the world, but I don't want to be offended. To which I say, well, grow up. Life is not like that. And I've spent my life trying to get rid of discrimination. It
was part of your role.
It was. I was commissioned on the Commission for Racial Equality. And, I've spent my life fighting against racism and sexism or whatever. But there is a balance. It's almost as if the pendulum has gone far too far one way. And if these little darlings who don't want to be hurt and, diddums, at the end of the day, if they go into the big wide world and find that, well, life isn't quite like that. And I do worry about it. And I mean, I think it's Singapore where they call these young people strawberries because they bruise easily. and we need to toughen them up because this is Asia's century. Well, I can tell you now, Asia ain't going to take any prisoners as they move forward. And we have got to take the challenges and the opportunities and the good stuff that this decade can bring Australia and bring Britain and bring Europe and America. We've got to take those challenges. Well, we're not going to get there if every time you have a bad day at the office, for some reason, platform it and say it's not your fault.
Now, clearly you're a successful business person. You sit on the board of a number of companies. You advise governments. You advise corporations. Many of our listeners are in business and they'd love to get your advice. But there's someone else who I believe would benefit from your advice as well. They're leaving the family business. They're going out on their own. What advice would you give the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, Harry and Meghan, about going into business?
What a wonderful question. Next. No, I'm sad, and I say this in January, by the way, and who knows by March whether things have developed much. Although I guess after the Queen's ruling just a few days ago, I would have thought people will now let the thing settle down and let them start trying to meld whatever type of life they want to meld, and probably there'll be some sort of review and judgment in a few months' time. I would have thought. We live in a free world, and if these people want to say we don't want this anymore, we want to live a private life. They've got every right to, and I would encourage them to do so, because if, frankly, they're desperately unhappy, it'll end in tears. But there are some constants, and this is the same when you're setting up any business. There are certain things you can't change, and we all know that you set up a business, and there are one or two things. It might be where your supplies come from. It might be what your customer base is. It might be where you're located. Whatever it is, there are one or two things you can't change. So you have to build your business accordingly, and you go with the flow, and you make the most of your opportunities and whatever. So one of them is that he is the Queen's grandson, full stop. Nothing's going to change it. Meghan, I think, has had this shock of her life that she married the spare and not the heir. and she's not being excluded because of any reason, and I will not have it that my country is any form of racist. This is not true. And she was welcomed by my country, and I'm not going to have it any other way. But it is true to say she wasn't in the inner cabal, in the inner circle. Why would she be? It's her brother-in-law that's the heir to the throne, not her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And on that basis, you see, she's probably been sitting there saying, I'm getting all the press media attention, but I'm actually being ignored in certain things. I'm being pushed to the outside of it. On that, well, of course you are. So's Princess Anne. So's Prince Edward. That is what being not in the line of heirdom brings to you. So they are obviously desperately unhappy, and they want it sorted. And he's got shades of what happened, the tragedy of what happened to his mum. I should think playing on his mind to a dangerous, probably too strong a word, but certainly to an extent that is uncomfortable. So they decided to do something about it. I don't know whether they chose Canada or Canada chose them, but at the end of the day, they're going to be there. So how to pull that off? Well, one, the Queen has behaved completely correctly. Get it done quickly. What do we need in business? End the uncertainty. Get it sorted. I don't care whether it's Brexit or the royal family. End the uncertainty. Get it sorted. So she's done that. Two, remember the goodwill in the business. Remember where your goodwill comes from. Remember, the customer, 1, 2, and 3 every time. And so the Queen has said the taxpayer paid to renovate that cottage and put the security in. Well, you're not going to actually do the stuff the taxpayer expected when it paid the money, so you'll pay it back. Excellent. 3, if you're going to go out into the wide world and you're going to actually start earning money yourselves, unspokenly it's going to be agreed that basically what you're going to do is be trading on who you are. For better, for worse, for good or bad, you're going to be trading on who you are. Well, all right, but you're not going to call yourselves Royal Highnesses. The jury's out there whether the website can be called Sussex Royal. I don't know where the Royal is allowed or not. I don't know the facts of that one. But they are going to have to trade to a certain extent on where they come from and what they are. So they've got to walk quite a tightrope between earning money personally, that in the mix there'll be charity work, where I think Meghan particularly will want to carry on her work with disadvantaged women, especially in Africa, which I applaud her for. I think that's marvellous. But there's going to be a mix. If one newspaper finds a story where she went on a charity gig and got 100 grand for herself, oh my God. And even if she says, well, that was the deal, I'm allowed to, the optics will be awful. So I think she's got challenges as to how she can earn money herself. The easiest thing for her to do would be go down to LA and do another TV
Suits
series.
was a fantastic TV show. Pam and I loved it. We'd love to have her back.
And she's talented. So, go and do that, make a load of dough. She could probably write her own check, to be honest. But if she's going to do the charity stuff mixed into it, no, I don't mean the TV, but I mean other stuff. Yes. It's difficult because she's going to be found out trying to make money herself at the same time. I think, is going to have a real problem because I think he'll miss. For instance, he's not going to be representing the Queen in military matters, so he's no longer going to be putting on the Air Force, Army or Navy uniform for various things. Remember, he went in harm's way in the British Army. Yes, he did. Bless him, brave man, more than I've ever done, and good on him for that. So there's a special bond for him with the military, and that's been broken. He can't do that because he can't represent the Queen. And so I think he's going to miss that desperately. I think he's going to miss the fact that it's the only life he's ever known. She's had another life. She then had a Hollywood life. She's come into this life. She's basically not liked it. So she's gone back out from this life. He is not only going to leave the only life he's ever known, but he's going to leave the country that is the only country he's ever known. And he's going to be 6,000 miles away, 3,000 across the pond and 3,000 across North America. And he's going to be 6,000 miles away. Actually, the one who's not going to be able to earn the money in quite the same way, because I think he will carry on doing the charity stuff. And the problem with that is it doesn't, nor should it, ever make you money. No. So I think there's a as a going out on their own bit, the private life bit will be the easiest. I think journalists who try to intrude on their private life will get short shrift in the British newspapers. I don't for a minute think that there will be plaudits for here is a hidden photograph of young Archie playing on the back lawn with his trike. People say, for God's sake, these people ran away from all this, leave it alone. But the business life of where they're going to be trying to make their money, I think, is legitimate media interest. I think it's in the public interest, and they will be watched like a hawk. And if he wanted to escape media attention by doing this, the private life side of what he's going to escape, I think, God bless him, well done. I personally like to see people stepping up to duty and not doing this, but we live in a different world and I've got to suck that up and understand it. More importantly, I wish them well. But in their public life of making money, if they thought they were, for some reason, running away from the media attention for that, well, they've got another thing coming.
Lord Digby Jones, I've really enjoyed our chat. Just to finish off, a common theme in history has been that progress happens too slowly, yet we tend to notice these setbacks, these terrible tragedies happening very quickly. They happen overnight. When we look back at the end of this decade, is there any prediction you can make of what we're going to be doing differently, what we're going to be thinking differently, that's going to slowly creep up on us that we weren't aware of?
I think the one thing is going to be the enormous shift in public opinion, business response, and governmental legislation on climate change. The one that I've always gone on about is you can always have the row about what causes climates to change. Is it mankind? Is it nature? Is it a mixture of the two? But you can't have an argument about who put plastic in the ocean or the rivers. There's only one person for that, and that's us.
Yes.
And I think the public have got that. And I think that one is going to be something we're going to find every day in every way. People are going to be behaving more sensitively to the environment. Governments are going to feel they can legislate more because they feel they've got the public on their side. And business, and good old business, leave it to them. If you start saying to business, no, we want a technological solution to this. We want technology to produce this. We have a much better chance if you encourage business rather than beat them around the head. But I think you'll see a huge plethora of the development of the electric car, electric propulsion. I think you're going to get a lot more sustainable energy. And you hope that the Chinas, the Indias and the United States, and dare I say it, Australia.
Well, Australia's got a problem with its coal, hasn't it?
Well, it has.
Let's be honest.
Well, it has. And I can remember sitting with John Howard in about 2003, I think it was. No, it was earlier than that. It was 2001. And I was in Canberra, Director General of the CBI, which is like the AIG group in Australia. And he and one or two of his people, and he gave me time, and he was very decent and very polite. And I can remember saying to him, what are you going to do when all this coal that you're digging out the ground and also burning, somebody tells you there's a better way of doing energy? What are you going to do? And I remember asking him that question, and I got very short shrift, basically. But the time is coming and I think over the next decade, one of the things Australia's got to do is don't let it creep up on you and find that one day no one wants your coal. Do something about it now, and set, dare I say it in a democracy, a better example. I think the other thing that you're going to see is a huge advancement in robotics and artificial intelligence. And if robotics in the manufacturing process did for so many of the manual jobs 20, 30 years ago, and society mopped up those manual jobs in other environments, well, this time I think you're going to find AI is going to deal with a lot of what my mum and dad's generation would call middle class jobs. So insurance, banking, accountancy, law, administration. You're going to find so many of those jobs going because computer says no. That there's going to be a fundamental shift in the way that the processing of the interface between the consumer and society changes. Now, I don't
If my computer will make an appointment with your computer so we can catch up with each other.
And you and I will be told where to turn up.
That's right.
And then there'll be something that comes out of the computer and bangs us over the head if we're late. And I think if I was a politician trying to persuade people it's going to be all right, you'd be saying words like, but there'll be new jobs created, there'll be bigger and better jobs created. And I think they're telling the truth, but you're going to need a different skill set to do it. You're going to need different education processes. You're going to need a different skill in society. And sadly, I think an awful lot of the people who will lose their jobs because of this won't skill back up. They won't go there. You'll have early retirements happening. You'll have a lot of despondency. You'll have a lot of mental health issues, all happening in a society which frankly has got strained social services at the best of times. And so lastly, that would segue into my last thing, which I think the next 10 years is going to see, mainly because society is going to be forced to deal with it as opposed to want to deal with it, which is we are getting an older society in the developed world. And there's not enough money to pay pensions. There's certainly not enough money for the state to pick up 100% of the tab on social care. And you're going to have people living longer, more actively. More people are going to have Alzheimer's. There's not more Alzheimer's per se. It's because you don't die of other stuff. So that's what you get. And why did cancer have a big uptick in incidence in the late 50s? Because World War wasn't killing them. There is an interrelationship. Well, what are we going to do, therefore, in the next decade to deal with people getting older, people needing more money spent on their healthcare and their social care? And, as David Attenborough said, and he's not as blunt as me, what national treasure would be. But he did say, one of the biggest problems with this environmental issue is there are just too many people. And you can't blame someone in Africa for having 10 kids when 5 die, and what's more, if they don't overfarm, they starve. So you've got to give them some sort of economic and social hope if you're going to get them to have fewer kids, and may I say some better health education. But in the developed world, we have immigration coming in, and there is nothing wrong with it if they're targeted, if the fact that we need their skill, but more importantly, that we have hospitals and schools and roads and railways and energy generation to cope with more people. Because if you don't, you end up with social division. Once you get social division, you get the polemicism. If that's fanned by social media, isn't that where I came in?
It is. But interestingly, that's one of the areas where Australia is more fortunate. It has got strong migration. 66% of our population growth is coming from targeted migration of people at household formation age, skilled migrants, and people coming in with business skills and business money. So that's balancing the baby boomers who are living longer and enjoying their life on cruises. That's why you and I are sitting on a cruise. Because
and you're still, I know everybody in Australia listening to this will think I'm being patronising, but I'm being absolutely deadly serious. I must have been to Aussie, 10, 15 times. I'm a visiting adjunct professor at the University of Western Australia in Perth, in their business school, and I really do genuinely love the place. And I never ever forget that you did send 2 generations of manhood to die so that I could be free. And I just feel that if anything can come that's good out of the next 10 years, it's a development of a stronger bond between my country and yours from a generation who weren't brought up with that sentiment at grandma's knee. I was brought up with that sentiment. I hate you guys for 5 days every 4 years when we play the Ashes. Other than that, I'm your best friend. There is a demographic change happening in Australia and a nation identity difference.
Oh yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I just want to make sure that the bond that your and my father's generation took for granted doesn't end up on the cutting room floor.
Well, Lord Digby Jones, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts about what's ahead. So I think the good news is we're living in the best time in history, in one of the best countries in the world. We've got a lot to look forward to, haven't we? And God bless you. And thank you for giving me time, because at the end of the day, if
we are going to all have an enjoyable and fruitful 10 years ahead in the new decade. It's going to be countries like Aussie and Britain that make it happen. And long may me, both of us, have a good quality lasting friendship.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, I hope you learned something from my chat with Lord Digby Jones. Clearly it's useful getting the perspective of somebody from across the other side of the world who's got a good perspective of business and the world at large. Now, if you did get some benefit and you know somebody else who'd enjoy it, why not tell them about the show? And if you want to tell the world about the show, why not leave a review? And if you do leave me a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever, and if I read it out, I'd be happy to say thank you by gifting you one of my books. And I'm going to read out a couple of reviews now. These came at the end of last year. I know it's already well into 2020, but I'm still catching up because I'm getting so many people leaving reviews, and I thank you for those. I really do appreciate them. There was a really short one left by Taz Carl saying, always informative. I listen regularly and keep up all the good work. There was another one from XER 1991, quality information, exceptional content, are highly recommended for anyone who's interested in property investing. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you both for leaving your reviews. And if you want to get back to me, send me an email, michael@metropole.com.au. I'd love to say thank you for doing that by gifting you one of my books. Now, if you want to keep in contact in between the twice weekly shows, you can catch me on social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and much more recently Instagram. I'd love to be in contact with you and for you to find out a bit more about what's happening with me. So catch up with me that way, or on my daily newsletter, propertyupdate.com.au. Look forward to catching up with you again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?